truly wonderful to be here with you this morning. Good morning. The opening words I want to offer are from an amazing anthology called Been in the Storm So Long. And the words that come to us today are from someone who is an ancestor in our faith, the Reverend Egbert Ethelred Brown, who 100 years ago founded the Harlem Unitarian Church. He's an immigrant from Jamaica, and he helped expand the vision of progressive religion in our city at a time when it was organized in such a way that hate seemed to be very powerful. But he said, in a world like that, we need to be concerned more so than ever with love. And I've encountered Reverend Brown's words at different points on my faith journey. Once upon a time, I was a very confused 24-year-old who walked down the street where I lived in Providence and happened to walk into an old Unitarian congregation. I sat in the back pew. I was a little confused that morning, but I heard stories and songs about love. And in different ways throughout my life, that call keeps beckoning. So this morning, I offer the words from Reverend Brown. As we face a troubled and puzzled world, we too are troubled and puzzled. As our fond dreams remain unrealized and our bright hopes of yesterday wither in the bitter disappointments of today, at times our courage fails, our spirits droop, our faith even trembles, and frustrated, we may bow our heads in despair. Nevertheless, we come to Spirit in this hour of worship. As we seek peace in our time, may we ourselves be at peace with the world, with ourselves, and with that which is greater. May we know that without love, there will never be peace. Teach us, O Spirit, therefore, how to love. What does this world need more than love? May we, after our time together, leave this place inspired and strengthened, faithfully to fulfill the possibilities of tomorrow. What does this world need more than love? And in that spirit, we gather today.
I invite you all to join me as we light our chalice. You can find the affirmation. It's in our order of service. We light this chalice in the search for truth and the spirit of love. We unite in worship and fellowship. As an extension of lighting our chalice, I want to take a moment to light these 3 additional candles for just some of the names for those who have recently been affected by police brutality. We cannot cover all the names of those affected. But this morning, we will light a candle for the life of Jared Gatula, for the life of Roberto Rivera, and for the life of Domingo Chun. May these lights be a symbol of our commitment to continue the work of racial justice and to proclaim that indeed Black lives matter. Now, if you would like to join in the opening hymn, please stand as you are able. We will be singing hymn number 1031, Filled with Loving Kindness, in your teal hymnal. Please stand as you are able, and we're led in song by our choir. So it's now the time in our service for joys and sorrows. If you are visiting us for the first time and would like to introduce yourself, we'd be charmed if you would like to do so. For those who are gathering in person, we'll invite you to raise your hand. I will come around with the mic. We're now moving into the time of meditation for our service. I'm going to offer a prompt. In fact, today I have two prompts because they were both so delightful. And I will offer those prompts, and then I'm going to sound the singing bowl. At that point, I invite you to sit in meditation, take some deep breaths. And after a few minutes, I will again ring the singing bowl to mark the end of our time. And the prompts that I have are as such. One is from Paul Tillich, the German-American philosopher and theologian. And he told us the first duty of love is to listen. And the second prompt is from Voltaire, French philosopher and writer. Love is a canvas furnished by nature and embroidered by imagination.
Silence is so powerful. As Unitarian Universalists, we draw upon and are inspired by sacred, secular, and scientific understandings that ground us in wisdom and compassion. Our reading today is from the contemporary author Zadie Smith and a selection from her 2020 pandemic-era collection, Intimations. Smith describes her collection as personal essays, small by definition, short by necessity. The following is a selection from the essay, A Woman with a Little Dog. She writes, "The funny thing about Barbara is that she has a little dog, Beck, who she insists is a very well-behaved dog, but who in reality either barks or tries to bite pretty much everyone who comes near, except Barbara. Barbara now will often be outside the bench of the local hairdresser, properly intended for clients of the salon. But no one minds because this is Barbara we're talking about, regular in habits and known to all. And one day there she sat, and I could see that Barbara was preparing to shout one of her ambivalent declarations at me about the weather or a piece of prose or some new outrage committed by the leader of the country, which in Barbara's mind only theoretically included her own city, New York. I was keen to hear it. But instead, Barbara said in a voice quieter than I'd ever heard her use, the thing is, we're a community and we've got each other's back. You'll be there for me and I'll be there for you and we'll all be there for each other, the whole building. There's nothing to be afraid of with this pandemic. We'll get through this together. We'll get through this together.
Now it is a time in our service where we take an offering. We know it is the gifts of all that help support our ability to gather and to thrive. For those attending in person, Randy and Sue will come around with the collection plate. If you choose, please use the envelope that you'll find in the pew, write your name and indicate whether your offering is part of your pledge or whether it's a donation, just so we can make sure that we record it properly. And for those online, links and instructions will be posted in the chat. You can mail us a check or donate through PayPal giving page on our website. And please give as generously as you can. Our offerings will now be gratefully accepted. Please join us in singing hymn number 134, our offertory hymn for today. Our world is one world. It's in your gray hymnal, and please stand as you are able.
What is love asking? All across our movement today, hundreds of congregations are asking that question as it relates to the climate crisis. There is an international Unitarian Universalist climate revival happening, where people are exploring in our context, how are we to respond to the call of love? We live in a time of heat waves and flooding. We live in a time of disruption and destruction. We live in a time that can seem profoundly and perpetually tempest-tossed. But when I look at our ancestors of faith, our context is distinct, but we are not the first people to grapple with how are we to respond to a world that seems drenched in hate and offer love. Nearly a century ago, in 1926, the Unitarian ministers and lay leaders of metropolitan New York gathered at Community Church, which is at the time was close to Grand Central Station. And a core discussion was anchored around the topic, what is the function of church? And the Christian Register, which was the predecessor publication of what we now call UU World, hopefully that magazine that you receive every season, the Christian Register reported, quote, in this discussion, Miss Dorothy Dyer of Union Theological Seminary reported the Evanston Conference, giving the various reactions of young people to the church and demanding that the church justify its existence by programs of social amelioration. For lay people, John Burnett Nash who is treasurer, a very hard volunteer job then and now, treasurer of the Unitarian Social Service Council and member of Community Church New York, urged that religious life not content itself with simply preaching and worship one day a week, but take up the task of social service. For ministers, Reverend H.G. Richardson of Yonkers, New York, conceived the business of religion to be the proclamation of the gospel and the building up of character, whereas Reverend Dr. Wakefield Staten of the West Side Unitarian Church, which once upon a time was on 110th Street, summed up the results of the other speakers, it says, quote, wittily and justly, and then went on to say that he thought the principal function of religious life was to pioneer a new truth. And it says, as an aside, quote, as part of the business meeting, Reverend Paul Chapman of Staten Island was voted secretary for the Metropolitan Conference. While ministers and lay leaders and adults were debating what is the purpose of Unitarian religious life in New York City, here on Staten Island, the children and RE teachers had an answer: love. In the 1920s, according to the records from the Christian Register, between 1921 and 1927, the Sunday school of this congregation made monthly donations for refugees and poor Unitarian children in Hungary, monthly, regularly making these donations. Hungary at the time was in a tumult. It was part of the defeated nation Austria-Hungary in World War I. It was extremely divided and extremely violent between left and rightists. And there was much poverty, especially among the small Unitarian communities that were often in rural areas. I don't know what prompted those collections, but I know that on this island, in this congregation over 100 years ago, in a world that was virulently hateful, regularly, children made collections to support our sister community on the other side of the world. That is amazing to me, because even though we are not far from that amazing Statue of Liberty, the 1920s New York was violent and mean. Even as people came from all over the world seeking freedom and escape, xenophobia, prohibition, suspicion was pervasive. And yet, on this island, instead of only raising money for causes in the city or in this immediate neighborhood, and of course that happened, this congregation was tempted to pursue love beyond the borders of the walls of sanctuary, borders beyond the boundaries of the city, even beyond the boundary of the nation. And so you who are sitting in the pews now, you are connected to this group of children who 100 years ago thought at the same time that this nation was putting up barriers to prevent immigrants from Asia and Latin America and Eastern Europe from coming to this country, this congregation felt, no, this is a time of connection. Connection, despite all odds. What inspired that commitment? According to the Reverend Allison Cornish and Reverend Jackie Clement, at the turn of the 20th century, about 90 Unitarian congregations would use the following mission or covenant as part of their services. It was first written by Reverend Charles Ames in Philadelphia after the Civil War. And it goes like this. In the love of truth and in the spirit of Jesus, we unite for the worship of God and the service of all. And this congregation was among those that recited and honored that covenant, worship and service for all people. And I hear echoes of that older covenant from Reverend Ames in your current Sunday affirmation, in a beautiful little book, The Small Church on Staten Island, by the Reverend Horace Pulpit, We can trace what he names as an evolution in concern, an expansion of the heart from a liberal Christian witness to just a broad liberal religious witness expressed in the mission of this congregation in the 1970s, and as you heard this morning, still in use today. Reverend Horace Pulpit said, "The covenant of the congregation is an adaptation of one that was recommended to the churches by the denomination 50 years after its incorporation, about 1900. In its present form, it is," this is what you heard at the chalice lighting, "in the search for truth and the spirit of love, we unite for worship and fellowship." He writes, "It will probably be changed again in the future, influenced by and helped by the larger Unitarianism, likely. But such words as truth, love, search, unite will remain as the essence of the what, the why, and the who. The what, the why, and the who. At our best, members of congregations in the 1920s and our congregations now in the 2020s are grounded in freedom and love. And that was then and still is now deeply countercultural. Love is the call to compassion and to welcome the stranger. And it looks different in different contexts. And it can be repressed or ignored. But love always shows up in this faith tradition, including right now. Friends, Unitarians and Universalists have been part of New York State for over 200 years. Over 200 years. On this island, you could go back to the 1850s and join a group that was trying to find a progressive way to be religious and fight for social justice. In the 1860s, Unitarian congregations across New York joined to create something called the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was a predecessor of the Red Cross and dedicated itself to providing medical care for Union soldiers of all backgrounds in the Civil War. In the 1870s, after the war, as testified in the book, The Gentle Radical, Reverend Octavius Frothingham, what a name, would denounce Tammany Hall and preach a religion dedicated to science, humanity, and the meaning of existence from his pulpit in Manhattan. As testified by Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed and Reverend Dr. Anthony Pinn in the 1920s, during the height of the Harlem Renaissance, you could have gone to church at the Harlem Unitarian Church, which was dedicated to mission, temple, and forum, spaces of debate, spaces of powerful preaching, and spaces of social action. The balance of all three was deeply important. Now, if you go to one of the YMCAs in Harlem, you can actually see a memorial plaque dedicated to the Harlem Unitarian Church and where it met for many years. Or you could have come here. And the Wayside Pulpit, the sign facing the street, came into existence, at least its predecessor form, under Reverend Paul Chapman, who himself was a former Methodist preacher who could no longer continue in his home tradition because he wanted to be more honest about his doubts and hopes. And after World War II, you could have gone to a Unitarian service in cities and neighborhoods around New York, from Yonkers to the Bronx, from Brooklyn Heights to Flatbush, from Hollis to the Upper East Side, from White Plains to Park Avenue. And inspired by the witness of Czech Unitarians who resisted fascism, you could have started to attend something new called Flower Communion. The first one was in Brooklyn, in America, in our state. The Cambridge congregation claims that they were first, but that's a debate. Or maybe you could have gone up to the Hudson Valley, where Croton is, or on Long Island to Bayshore or Freeport, and met these groups of people who are trying to start new Unitarian congregations. Spaces to be honest, spaces for interfaith families, spaces to resist the war in Vietnam, or fight for equal access to jobs and department stores in the city. In the 1980s, as AIDS ravaged the lives of so many young people, Many of our congregations became loving sites of hospice, advocacy for freedom and deep care, and profound resistance to homophobia. The late Reverend Orlando Brugnola is still remembered poignantly in Brooklyn for her AIDS care ministry. All Souls New York took out ads in the subway declaring AIDS is a human disease and deserves a humane response. And as you all know, in the aftermath of 9/11, lay leaders and ministers like Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt responded with love during that horrific moment and its still unfolding aftermath, offering aid, comfort, and support to those in mourning and solidarity with local Muslim and Sikh communities wrongly being harassed by bigots. In 2004, two brave New York UU ministers, Reverend Kay Greenleaf and Reverend Dawn Sangre, were arrested for officiating at 13 same-sex weddings in New Paltz, New York. Their arrest was part of a broader movement building LGBT equal marriage under the law. New York marriage became equal in June 24, 2011, and across the country in 2015. But as you know better than most, the horror of Hurricane Sandy, which affected so many communities in this area, was followed by months, if not years, of cleanup and restoration across the region, and this congregation was part of that story of healing. And there are many congregations right now in Florida and other parts of our country who are experiencing and living with tremendous disruption from extreme weather right now, this Sunday. Historically, our congregations come to life when we lean into love. I want to show you something. This is from 1979, 1980. It's a book. It is the Directory of Unitarian Congregations in the New York metropolitan area. I love this book. Many of these congregations don't exist right now. But you do. But you do. And there's a reason. Not all, but some of our congregations are tempted to only focus on the beautiful space within the sanctuary walls. And when that happens, a toxic sickness takes place. It doesn't matter if the congregation has a ton of money or is just making it week to week. It's the orientation. Is it just in the wall, or is there a curiosity? Is there a welcoming for the new person? And those welcomes are so important because they can change lives. They can change lives. I think one of the most powerful gifts of our movement is that because we're so old, because we've been around for a while, we inherit these wild, beautiful sanctuaries, things that would never get built now for a variety of reasons. But what makes them distinct is their quirkiness, their uniqueness, their stubbornness. We have to figure out what is distinctive in the places we are and respond in love. There's a congregation on Long Island that their chapel is a converted garage. Their windows, they created beautiful stained glass windows in this little garage chapel, one for each world religion. And then during the week, they run a food pantry. And that's their property. That's their property. And it doesn't matter if you have a ton of resources or a few, but the orientation, that's where the heart of our faith is. And I go there sometimes just to get a little energy because by the numbers, they shouldn't exist. Like 30 members. I think at the high point, maybe they were 50 at one point. But it's just different people have come in over the years and preserved this hub, little organized site of compassion. In Brooklyn, you go to the congregation in Brooklyn Heights, there's a chapel to the right side. It's called the Chapel of All Faiths. And it was also constructed in the 1920s. And it has symbols of many of the world's religious traditions. It has a Madonna, a fish symbol for Christianity, a menorah, a prayer rug, prayer candles, an icon of Confucius, and a wooden carving from the 19th century abolitionist minister at the second Brooklyn Unitarian congregation, Samuel Longfellow. And the inscription reads, "Light of ages and of nations, of every time, all have received thine inspiration, glimpses of truth sublime." And since its inception, many interfaith couples have held marriage ceremonies in that side chapel. In 1965, early in the tenure of Reverend Don McKinney, that congregation, and specifically in that chapel, it was a host to a religious professor and exile from South Vietnam, Dr. Vo Thanh Minh. Dr. Thanh Minh participated in a 6-month fast and public witness at that chapel to protest the war. Individual pilgrims, reporters, and the congregation as a whole learned from him and helped publicize his mission for peace. And he created a special calligraphy, still part of the chapel, which reads in translation, "God and all people are one." You could go there this afternoon and look at it. After the good doctor returned to South Vietnam, he was arrested for treason for criticizing the military government in Saigon. The doctor's allies here in the New York Unitarian community mobilized and worked with the State Department and New York's US senators to pressure for his release, which was granted. But what is so painful is that he later died. He was killed in a bombing from a US Air Force plane. Even today, some members of that community in Brooklyn recall speaking to the witness, the power, the presence, the sanctification of that space. So, friends, what is the function of a congregation? Looking at our ancestors, I would argue to love, to create space for love, to create communities for love to manifest. And that's true whether it's the 1850s or the 1920s or the 1970s or right now. We are faced, you and I both live in the same country, we are faced with a profound ache in the world. But we have the gift to show up where we can, how we can, with the people around us. We are able to answer love in our day-to-day interactions. And when we come together, we pursue and create communities that embody and echo voices of love in wider and wider circles. The children in this congregation in the 20s sent a ripple of love on the other side of the world. Congregations throughout this region have brought love into rooms and hospitals, protest marches, in zoning board rooms. Love keeps showing up. Love keeps showing up. And the question is, how will we answer? It's easy to say, and I know it's hard to do, but I find something transformative when I'm with a community where we're pledging service and worship and love and fellowship. It makes me feel like I'm not alone. Other people are trying to do this too. And if I'm cowardly or hesitant at a different moment, and then I see someone pushing the boundary, it's like, I gotta go. It's time. It's time. In the ancient book of Isaiah, there was this phrase of high praise, the highest praise. You have been strength to the poor, a strength to the needy in distress, a refuge from the storm, a shadow from heat. This congregation has had many people over the centuries who were strength and a shadow in the heat. They knew the function of a congregation. And as Reverend Pulpit wrote in the 1970s, quote, such words as truth, love, search, and unite will remain as the essence of the what, the why, and the who. May you and I discern the function of the congregation for the people of our time, and in ways known and unknown, may we always seek to respond to the call of love. May it be so.
Thank you, Reverend Lawlor. Thank you very much. Now, for our closing hymn, please join in singing hymn number 131. You'll find it in your gray hymnal, Love Will Guide Us. Please stand as you are able. And I invite you now to join in extinguishing our chalice. You can find that information in our order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. For these we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
In ways known and unknown, with people who we love and people we haven't met yet, may we constantly ask and seek to embody, what is love asking? May it be so. May you know peace this week.
And so ends our service. Please come into the parish hall, join for some hospitality.